Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last session of the festival, which is Voices from the Foothills, Pakistani English Verse. The chair is Raja Changez Sultan, and the panelists are Risham, Amjad, Waqas, Naeem, and the moderator for the session is Ammar Aziz, who is a poet, translator, filmmaker, and has won awards for his documentary films. Over to you, Ammar.
Thank you, Muniza. Good evening. Very glad to be here this evening. We don't have a lot of people. I think this says a lot about the Pakistani English poetry scene. But we are very privileged to have a couple of distinguished poets here. We have Raja Changez Sultan, who is a poet and painter from Islamabad, and he holds degrees in creative writing and journalism from Columbia University. And as a painter, he has exhibited in over 60 countries, his published poetry includes 13 Ways of Looking at a Nomad and The Death of Indifference and other poems. We have Waqas Naeem, who's a poet and a writer. Waqas is the co-founder or the founding director of Desi Writers Lounge, which is a South Asian literary collective. And we have Risham Amjad. Risham has been publishing poetry in several journals, for example, the Alif Review and a couple of others. She can add more to this. And she is otherwise a climate expert. So we'll have a little discussion first, and then we'll invite everyone to read. I think, I've just been thinking about this short story by Kafka, one of his last works, in which he talks about a message, from a dying emperor. Like, there's a king who's on his deathbed, and he's very desperate to send this message to you, to the reader. The story is written in the second-person narrative, and the emperor, he asks one of his messengers, to listen to the message, and then the messenger starts this never-ending journey. So he's trying to, get out of the palace, but it's so huge, it's so infinite, If he ever manages to do that, says Kafka, he'll never be able to cross the stairs because there are so many steps, he can never cross that. But if he ever does that, there will be a never ending and ever expanding city, and no one ever can get through that, let alone a messenger, from an emperor who's been dead, for a long time. I think this is a great metaphor for Pakistani English verse, because can we maintain some silence, please? आप लोग जरा यहाँ पे थोड़ी सी खामोशी प्लीज रखिएगा. कम लोग हैं ना, थोड़ी आवाज ज़्यादा आप लोगों की आ रही है. शुक्रिया. I think this story, actually, I'm borrowing it to reflect the situation of Pakistani English verse, because we have such a rich tradition. Our poets have been writing for a very long time, but that message somehow doesn't seem to reach the reader, And we can actually, I wouldn't have shared this example if we had a house full today, but it's so empty, and this just says a lot about the situation in the country. So starting all the way from Ahmad Ali to Zulfikar Ghosh, Shahid Hussain, Tawfiq Rafat Sahab, Kaleem Umar, Adrian Hussain, and who's still writing, and Salman Tariq Qureshi, and Maki Qureshi. So, there's a long list of people who have been writing for decades now, who have published works here and abroad, but somehow or the other, they haven't really found the readers in the country that they live in, or in the country that they write in. So when we write, who do we write for? And why do we still write if we don't have readers? So I'd just like to open the discussion, I'd like to start with you, Raja Saab, if you would like to add your thoughts about this. Because we are isolated, why are we still writing?
Well, Why do we write? I think we write to understand the world around us, and we write to contribute something if we have something significant to say. And the language becomes a medium primarily because whether we grow up in Urdu or whether we grow up with English, it does kind of carve the path that we follow in times to come in later life. I think every poet has something to say, and he says it regardless of whether the hall is 100% full or if it's just a pair of ears that are eager to hear what you have to say. Writing is something that defines a person. It first of all teaches you who you are, and it also then teaches the world who you could be with your contributions, or what the world is if they see it through your eyes for that period of time. Each one of us has a writer in them if they want to let it out. Just like each one can be a poet or a painter or a musician or anything that defines creativity. So, does an audience matter? Yes, it does. But does it matter so much that you think that you don't have to write because the audience is not there? There the answer is that no, it doesn't matter that much. You get to know yourself, you get to know the ways of aesthetically expressing certain things, and it's a way of life that people just adore. I was a student in mathematics and physics before I went off to England and the States. And over the period, they translated into poetry and painting as opposed to math and physics. And I couldn't really be happier because you end up coming to terms with a whole lot that's in the world through these arts. Give yourself a chance, and some good will come out of you in the context of a contribution to the world at large. You know? I'm sorry, you named a few poets from Pakistan. Those who do read English poetry, they are benefited by it. It's not that it's a totally lost cause or something. And I have seen audiences much larger than this, and I read there. I was poet for the state of Connecticut in 1972. And my first MFA from Columbia University is in creative writing. And then the journalism aspect came in later. So any kind of exploration that one does in a creative sense, if you're a painter or a poet or a musician, it defines you primarily. And then, if that definition is strong enough, you end up contributing to the world at large. So I'm sure
it's an interesting question to start out with, because just as we were walking in, Waqas and I know each other, I asked him when the two of us dinosaurs would begin releasing or putting up our poetry on an online platform like an Instagram or a blog, which is the way I think most English poetry is read these days. That's where a lot of poets publish now, and it's a lot more democratic in that way, I guess. So I don't know, maybe physical spaces, is not where English poetry in Pakistan is meant to live, because we have the paradigm of the Urdu mushaira, which is extremely communal. and has a call and response. And as a nation, I would not say that they are not readers of poetry. I believe that everyone loves poetry, Urdu poetry. But then, there is only a certain amount of people that speak English, and then of them, there are only a certain amount that then read poetry in English, and then of them, only a certain amount that write in English. So when you narrow it down further and further, maybe this is how it exists in a physical sense. But I feel that younger poets, they're online, they're writing, they're releasing their work, perhaps not in anthologies in Pakistan, because unfortunately we don't have a great tradition of English publishing houses for our work, but abroad, certainly. And I think to Raja Saab's point, all of us who first started writing did it in a totally solitary sense. It was just us. And that was perhaps why we did it, why we needed to do it. And then, of course, it ends up being universal. You read it here and there, publish it, so on and so forth. But I don't think I've ever needed to be read as a poet. I've always needed to write it, to exorcise it. And I think any time it's become about finding an audience, the poetry has become absolutely crap. So that's one part of it. But it's necessary to have an ecosystem of peers, and it's necessary to have an ecosystem of readers, because it does bring life to your community, and you do learn from each other, and you do need that. And I think moments in which I feel like I've grown intensely as a writer has been because others around me have been writing, and we've been sort of feverishly sending our work back and forth, and working on it together in a community, and that was important. Waqas.
Thank you so much. और शुक्रिया अम्मार और इस्लामाबाद लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल के organizers का. I think we're at the tail end of the festival, so it's understandable that the audience is elsewhere. The closing ceremony या हमारे यहाँ पर turnout जो है वो ज़्यादा नहीं है. But I've always believed, as English fiction or poetry writers in Pakistan, where, like Risham also pointed out, not many people maybe read or write in English. We don't need to be apologetic, about the lack of audiences. An audience of one is sometimes enough. And I think ये जो Changez साहब ने भी बात की कि that impulse for writing, it comes from within. आपने Ammar एक Austro-Hungarian writer Kafka की मिसाल दी. I'll throw an Austrian poet back at you. तो रिल्के ने जब उन्होंने मशवरा दिया था एक यंग पोइट को, तो he said कि art is good